Exactly. And even though I will speak about Gen AI a bit, because that's the focus of our talk today, you can also ask metaverse and XR related questions, because that's something that I've worked on in the past. But let's dive right in. I'm so happy to see so many of you here at such a late hour today. Today, we're going to talk about responsible innovation and how to shape a future where technology serves humanity. So just a couple of sentences about me. My name is Jenny Bettinger. I'm part of Accenture's Responsible Metaverse team. And I am also a World Economic Forum Fellow of the Defining and Building the Metaverse initiative, and have written some of their thought leadership around social implications of the metaverse in the past year. So as I said, if there are any questions that are not directly related to the presentation, but to using and deploying XR responsibly, also feel free to drop them in the Slido. I would like to start this talk in a bit of an unconventional way today. And in order to do so, I have to introduce you to one of my colleagues whose name is Elias. He's sitting in the front row. Maybe you can wave to everyone, Elias. In the manner of responsibility and ethics, I need to let you know that Elias is informed about what's going to come. Sorry. So this is Elias. He's very kind. He's part of our robotics team. He's very courageous to let me use him for this experiment. So my question to you across this room is, who of you thinks that it would be okay to just walk up to Elias and punch him in the stomach without a reason? That's exactly what I was not hoping for. But well, I actually forgot to flip the slides. I'm just realizing that. Okay, here we go. So obviously the majority, or thankfully the majority of the room does not think that it's okay to just walk up to people and punch them. So what do you think why that is? I think there's a pretty simple answer to that, and that's because it's bad. At some point of time, we as a global society have all sat at a big metaphorical kitchen table, and we have established that some things in our lives are good and some things are bad. And a number of mysterious ethical components are telling us that just walking up to people and punching them is bad. In our everyday actions, it feels very simple to distinguish bad from good. But when we design, build, and deploy technologies, things become a little more complicated. Why is that so? And how can we acknowledge collective ethical norms that guided the development of technology? More than a decade ago, entrepreneur and interface designer Asa Raskins invented the infinite scroll. That's the feature you use when you're scrolling through your social media or through e-commerce sites. With an initial aim to create a more seamless user experience, we all know today that this feature has highly addictive properties. We see decreasing attention spans in young adults, rising levels of stress, and a healthcare system strained by cases of depression. And while we might not be able to connect those things directly to that addictive technology, voices are getting louder and louder that there is a connection between them. Platforms from social media to e-commerce are punching people in the face or in the stomach on a daily. And haven't we just established that that's a bad thing to do? Responsible innovation means taking care of the future through collective stewardship of science and innovation in the present. In the past years, Raskins has repeatedly acknowledged that his technology is addictive and has a negative impact, and also has apologized for this. If 15 years ago, the concept of responsible innovation would have been more widely known and accepted, would we have ended up with an infinite scroll after all? Technologies are gaining more and more influence in how we conduct our lives, how we shape our opinions, how we communicate, how we interact, and how we act. Which is why it's increasingly important to consider their impact on individuals, on groups, and on entire societies. So today we want to learn a bit more about this. We want to learn about ethical norms, how we can guide ethical decision-making, and how we can put ethical principles to action when developing technology. I want to kick it off by introducing you to two perspectives to guide ethical decision-making. Just to be clear, these aren't ethical schools in themselves, but they are guided by them. Also, this is a bit dry, I'm aware of that, but it makes up great pub quiz knowledge. So if you just listen for that reason, that's okay. So the first perspective we want to look into is the perspective, or a perspective considering universal rights. And the second perspective we want to look into is a perspective considering happiness and harm. First, we'll explore an approach to ethical decision-making that emphasizes moral norms, rights, principles, and obligation. This perspective is deeply ingrained in Immanuel Kant's philosophy, who is somebody you might have heard about before. He lived in the 18th century, so I could not find a nice photo of him for certain obvious reasons. So I generated one of him eating strawberry ice cream using Midjourney, and I think it turned out pretty nicely. So Kant's philosophy is twofold. On the one hand, Kant proposes that our actions should be guided to principles we'd be prepared to apply to everybody around the globe. This idea is very much ingrained to how we approach human rights as well. They don't just apply to certain people, but to every person equally. Secondly, he proposes that we should always perceive people as a means, as an end in themselves, and never use people just to pursue or to achieve our own specific goals. So combining the two, an action or technology would be morally good if it respects universal right and thus does not treat people as a means to an end. Some rights we could potentially look into beyond the human rights are also the rights of autonomy and dignity, or for example, transparency. Autonomy means the ability to freely choose. Dignity means being valued in oneself, which is very much aligned with what Kant said. And then transparency is aligned with honesty and informed decision-making. So let's go back to the infinite scroll, and I want to give you a second to think about it. When we look at the infinite scroll, the future that lets you scroll that we just talked about, do you think when looking through a rights perspective, the infinite scroll is morally good, or is it rather questionable? I just heard it. Questionable, yeah, right. Exactly, it's rather questionable. So first of all, users can't really choose if they want to use the feature or not, right? So there is not really an autonomy in them being able to choose. Also, from the beginning, especially, they weren't really informed on the addictive nature of the feature. So from this perspective, we could say, okay, that's possibly an ethically questionable feature. The second perspective I want to look into with you together today is utilitarianism, which is coined by John Stuart Mill, who you can see on the right, riding a really tiny bicycle. He said, or he wanted us to weigh the overall happiness of an action, or that an action is likely to bring about in absence of pain. So he asked us to look at the overall happiness that, for example, a technology creates, and then in a perfect world, we could put up an equation and deduct the pain from that. Obviously, that doesn't really work that way, but it's a good way to like have a good moral or ethical perspective on certain things. When he talks about happiness, he doesn't talk about joy or happiness as we might interpret it today, but rather about physical, psychological, emotional, political, or environmental well-being. However, in real life, there are a couple of considerations we want to take with this perspective. We want to not only look into direct effects, but also indirect and long-term effects. And we do also want to consider not only the aggregate happiness, but also the happiness of those who might be marginalized or might be disadvantaged in gaining happiness from a certain action or technology. So when we go back to the infinite scroll, we want to ask questions like, who are the people affected by that? In what way are they affected? And will this technology create more happiness than harm? Again, there, I want to give you a brief second to think about it. Do you think within this perspective, it's a good technology, or is it rather questionable? Right. Obviously, this infinite scroll didn't only bring us harm. Like, it's a great feature. We can consume a lot of content, but there are a lot of ethical or a lot of considerations that come with that. On the one hand, the long-term or unintended effects, the addictive nature, were foreseeable. So companies did know that what this future might bring about. Also, it might potentially negatively the potential negative impact on vulnerable popularities might be larger than the impact on non-vulnerable popularities. Okay. Next to other ethical lenses, such as virtue ethics, care ethics, and the common good perspective, these philosophies can help us decide if something is morally good or bad. However, that decision isn't always super easy. If you want to know more about this, and you don't want to read through all the philosophical literature, there is a guy named Michael Schur, who was a writer on The Office, and also wrote The Good Place, which you might know. And he published a book that is called How to Be Perfect. And that one is really good. So if you want to learn more, feel free to read this. So I want to take a little pit stop. What have we learned so far? We kind of know what ethics is. We kind of know how to distinguish good from bad. And we kind of know some lenses or perspectives to guide our decision making. Next, we want to look into... Oh, this is so confusing because it's two. Next, we want to look into the potential moral challenges the technologies that we're going to deploy in the future could bring about. And we want to see how we can really approach those in a very practical way. And we want to start by having a look into the potential moral issues of generative AI, as this is the focus topic of our conference today. So as we've seen throughout a lot of presentations, especially Matthias's keynote this morning, Gen AI has a large potential to bring about very, very positive impact. Here we can see a news article that could be from the year, hopefully, 2035. And it already tells us that artificial intelligence finds the universal cure for all diseases on the planet. Probably that's not going to happen, but we see where this is going. We see that Gen AI could have a very positive impact. It helps us automate tasks. It helps us with decision making, and it can really enable creativity and advances in fields like healthcare or education. However, it does also carry a darker side. And I don't want to draw a dystopian picture here, but there are a lot of different ethical considerations when we're talking about generative AI. One of them being that it has the capacity to create misleading content, misinformation and disinformation, and erode the trust in digital media. It could potentially create universal harm and hurt the principles of autonomy, transparency, dignity, and more. So, quick question, is allowing technologies that could potentially harm people responsible? Spoiler alert, the answer is no. So should we just prohibit these technologies altogether because they could create harm? The answer is also no. When we're developing technologies, this becomes a lot more granular, and we need more granular approaches to ethical technology or to responsible technology. And that is why we're going to look into the approach of responsible innovation now. As good consultants, we obviously have a framework for this. This one actually is from the Technical University Delft. They're really leading in this field. So if you want to learn more about responsible innovation, they have great online courses that you can look into and learn more about the practical application, but also the ethical background of responsible innovation. So how do we approach responsible innovation in a practical manner? First, we identify ethical principles or why it's impacted. Where we're talking about principles like transparency or autonomy, that could look differently than when we're looking at principles such as privacy. And obviously, especially in the context of privacy, this might be very, very regulated. So this whole process goes hand in hand with regulation. So once we've identified a principle that is impacted, and we will look into this in a practical approach in a minute, we ideate potential positive and negative consequences. Then coming from these consequences, we ideate or evaluate certain measures for mitigation. So how can we kind of avoid that these consequences are going to happen? And last, but importantly, not least, we want to implement the results as requirements for design, adoption, and change. We weren't good consultants if we wouldn't have a second framework on this. At Accenture, we use different frameworks for responsible metaverse and responsible AI. This one is one that we created or are using for responsible metaverse. And this one is very much guided by a collaboration with a couple of companies and the World Economic Forum, and it's focused around digital trust. And what we do here is we basically set goals for creating digital trust, which you can see on the outer ring. And we have listed some domains, dimensions, or principles, or even rights in the inner circle. So basically, thinking about the approach we looked into before, we could just pick one of these and best all of them at one point, and then ideate consequences and considerations or mitigation strategies from that. And I do want to walk through some of these principles with you together in the frame of some examples. So the first example would be transparency. So we have the same use case or same case as we did before. There is a Gen AI that can create images, and they might be triggering misinformation and might cause an erosion of the trust in digital media. So now we have established the principle, the consequence, and what we now need to think about is mitigation strategy. So my question to you, can you think of anything that we could do from a technical perspective, from an organizational or from a managerial perspective that we could implement so we can avoid the harm, the generation of misleading content from Gen AI systems? Yeah, definitely. There could also be techniques for watermarking AI art, or there could be some kind of points where we can identify AI-generated art. We could also set in place really good reporting mechanisms on social media pages so we can make sure that fake content can successfully and efficiently be reported. So there are quite a lot of things that we could implement here to avoid negative effects. I want to walk through another example with you, and that would be focused around safety. When we're talking about safety, we're not only talking about physical safety, which is a large consideration actually for robots, but we're also talking about emotional or psychological safety, or even cognitive aspect. So imagine there's a VR experience and you need to play it for 3 hours to reach a certain milestone. But studies tell us that already 30 minutes of VR exposure could potentially harm humans' health. What could we put in place to make sure we avoid that potential harm? Again, from a technical or managerial perspective. Does anything come to mind? Yeah. We could inform users, like use transparency, tell them, like if you play for more than 30 minutes, that could be potentially harmful for you. It could engage breaks, so the user has to take breaks while playing or while using an application. So all of these considerations could be built into an application to make sure it is deployed or built responsibly and also used responsibly. So in summary, I just want to repeat the definition again. Responsible innovation means taking care of the future through collective stewardship of science and innovation in the present. We do so by establishing an understanding of ethical perspectives and principles, anticipate potential consequences, and ingrain responsibility into how we design, build, and deploy technologies. We aim for a future in which building technology responsibly will be as much of a collective understanding and norm as it is not to punch people in the stomach without a reason. Thank you very much.
Now it's time for your questions, and I think you have still time to post them. I will start with those that we have for now. To what extent should innovators be held accountable for foreseeing consequences of their creations, and how might this accountability be enforced?
So that's could be a sort of a governance topic as well. That's something, so when we're talking about responsible technology, I think we have a lot of stakeholders that take accountability or take responsibility. Obviously, we have public bodies that regulate. We have academia that needs to research potential effects so we can regulate and adjust accordingly. And then we have companies that need to be incentivized to build responsibly. Right now, that is rather happening in an approach of something goes wrong and then there's the backlash. But I think that is going to change in the future, because just today we saw that the awareness for ethical use of technologies is becoming just so much bigger. So yeah, I think accountability will be a much larger topic in the future.
Do you think that implementation of more ethical rules will be realistic by current big IT companies? Who would define the final ethics and philosophy?
Okay, so a lot of companies are hiring ethics teams. Those are also usually the first ones that are laid off again if things don't go too well. But a lot of companies actually have established principles, especially now in the frame of AI. A lot of large companies have established AI guidelines. Also, I think, and that is more of a personal view, but I think that's very much supported by Accenture as well, that Gen AI is going to drive that even more, because we can just develop for a larger breadth or broad range of individuals and of needs in that frame. So I think, sorry, I forgot the question. Yes, it's realistic.
So I think then we will continue, because it's looks like connected. How can policymakers and industry leaders prioritize a long-term social well-being over short-term economical gain?
So one thing we do really need, and we realized that when we wrote the WEF papers, is sufficient research on effects, especially if we're talking about individuals, but also societal ripple effect. When that's not there, regulators will not be able to regulate accordingly. So that's definitely a need. We need more collaboration between private, public sector and academia in that frame. So I think that's very interesting for all of you guys as well, because we are in an academic institution here. And I think, and that's exactly why we're standing here today and talking about this topic, the more we talk about it, the more it becomes an ethical norm, and the higher pressure will be on companies to build design responsibly. So it's so important that we bring this conversation out there, that you, like, when you sit together with your grandma at the kitchen table tonight, that you tell her about responsible innovation so she can tell the baker, and the baker then tells somebody else. And that was probably not the best example, but I think conversation is so important in that frame. And that's discussion is how we shape norms. And that's why we need to fuel discussion, have good regulation, and incentivize companies to build responsibly.
I think it's the same question, but from another point, how can big companies be responsible if they want to increase attention time? So if company still wants to punch your face, your stomach,
yeah,
how can it be that companies will become responsible, but you say due to such discussions?
Yeah. So I think one thing, greenwashing was a huge thing and still is at some degree, but greenwashing was such a large thing years ago, and it's becoming less and less of a thing because people become more aware of what sustainability means. So again, conversation, incredibly important, and awareness creation and knowledge about the topic is super important. And also companies are terrified of backlashes. I'm not sure if you've heard about the Amazon algorithm for HR CV selection that was actually never implemented, but they realized that it kind of only hired male developers because all the positions were filled with male developers in the past. So it was pretty biased. And even though that was never, I think, implemented, as far as I remember, there was a huge backlash around that, and people talk about it all the time. So companies are scared of these kinds of media backlashes, and that's just giving them another incentive to really be responsible and not just talk about it.
Okay, so I think it was also one connected. Do you believe we will actually in some time get to define proactive rules instead of a retrospective definition of the rules once the harm is already serious?
So the last sentence I'm not sure if I understood, but I think that's kind of what the AI Act is doing right now as well. So I think regulatory attention has become like much larger. Obviously, regulatory processes are quite slow, but still, I think there is a big aim on speeding that up. And they're not slow because they don't want to be fast. They're slow because it just needs a lot of like instances to approve a regulation. So I do think that we'll get to a more proactive way of setting regulation.
Thank you. How can organization ensure transparency in the innovation processes, especially when involving artificial intelligence or other emerging technologies?
So I think there's a saying that says, do good things and talk about them. So while, as we just said, regulation sometimes is reactive at the moment, like it's very important for industry leaders to set standards in that way. And for example, for AI, Microsoft has been very leading when it comes to responsible AI standards or principles. So I think that responsibility becomes such like kind of a selling point for companies in that way.
So we have a question regarding metaverse. How can the metaverse be designed to inclusively represent and respect the diverse cultures and history of its global user base?
Oh, I love that one. So that's actually one of the topics that we wrote about in the metaverse paper. And there are different aspects to that. There is metaverse leadership. There were studies by McKinsey a couple of months ago, and they showed that over 50% of metaverse users are female, but over 90% of metaverse leaders were male. So the first thing we can very easily do is just build diverse teams, because diverse teams will create diverse creations. So I think that's the first step of building more diverse technology and inclusive technology. And then the second step is also looking into the environment. How are people represented? What's the level of accessibility? I think these are all considerations that we need to take when talking about inclusivity and diversity in in the metaverse, and there are already a lot of groups and initiatives really discussing these topics as well. So how can we design diverse avatars? How can we make sure everybody can access the technology, because it's a very mobile technology, you need to move a lot. So how can we make sure that people with disabilities can use it? How can we make sure it's not overwhelming for those with cognitive impairments? So there's a lot happening in this frame, and I could talk about this for an hour, so I better stop now.
Okay, then I will also this question about metaverse. What mechanism should metaverse creators establish to adapt and respond to unforeseen societal and ethical challenges that arise within their platforms?
When we're talking about creators, are we talking to the ones building content or the ones talking platforms? I guess maybe rather platform creators. So I think exactly...
I think it's more about content, no? From my perspective,
Okay. So I think exactly, it always makes sense to keep in mind these principles that we looked at earlier today. So have in mind, okay, there's the principle of fairness. Is what I'm creating right now, is it fair? Does it include everyone? There's the principle of sustainability. Is what I'm building right there, or what I'm designing right there, fostering the thought of sustainability. There's the principle of privacy. So I think just having those in mind and knowing they exist will make it much easier for us to create responsibly.
The last but not the least, in what ways can interdisciplinary collaboration between fields like science, humanities, and the arts foster a more holistic and responsible approach to innovation?
I think this is actually a very important question, and I'm actually heading to a panel to talk about this as well. So science, humanities, and arts especially as well, all of these areas and even more other areas as well, they shape how we see the world. Our perception is our reality. So I think having collaboration between these entities is very vital, so we can make sure we're not getting too biased while we're spending all of our time on digital media, while we are hanging out in echo chambers and always see the things that we're shown in our social bubbles. So I think in the frame of shaping behaviors and shaping opinions, collaboration between these entities is very important. How exactly they can shape or make innovation responsible is kind of the approach that I talked about before. All of these will guide regulation. Always, all of these will guide how companies establish policies and how businesses create technology. So I think, as I said a million times already, I'm going to say it one last time, I promise, conversation and discussion around this topic is just incredibly important.
Thank you. It was our last question, so nothing more. Thank you for interesting discussion and answering the questions. Glad that you had a lot of them. So thank you.
Thanks.